Barrabas by Par Lagerkvist. Chapter 1. Everyone knows how they hung there on the crosses, and who they were that stood gathered around him. Mary, his mother, and Mary Magdalene, Veronica, Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross, and Joseph of Arimathea, who shrouded him. But a little further down the slope, rather to one side, a man was standing, with his eyes riveted on the dying man in the middle, watching his death throes from the first moment to the last. His name was Barabbas. This book is about him. He was about 30, powerfully built, with a sallow complexion, a reddish beard, and black hair. His eyebrows also were black, his eyes too deep set, as though they wanted to hide. Under one of them he had a deep scar that was lost to sight in his beard. But a man's appearance is of little consequence. He had followed the mob through the streets all the way from the governor's palace, but at a distance, somewhat behind the others. When the exhausted rabbi had collapsed beneath his cross, he had stopped and stood still for a while to avoid catching up with the cross, and then they had got hold of that man Simon and forced him to carry it instead. There were not many men in the crowd except the Roman soldiers, of course. They were mostly women following the condemned man and flock of urchins who were always there when anyone was led out along their street to be crucified. It made a change for them. But they soon tired and went back to their games, pausing a moment to glance at the man with the long scar down his cheek who was walking behind the others. Now he was standing up here on the gallows hill, looking at the man on the middle cross, unable to tear his eyes away. Actually, he had not wanted to come up here at all, for everything was unclean, full of contagion. If a man set foot in this potent and accursed place, part of him would surely remain, and he would be forced back there, never to leave it again. Skulls and bones lay scattered about everywhere, together with fallen, half-moldering crosses, no longer of any use, but left to lie there all the same, because no one would touch anything. Why was he standing here? He did not know this man, had nothing to do with him. What was he doing at Golgotha, he who had been released? The crucified man's head hung down, and he was breathing heavily. It would not be long now. There was nothing vigorous about the fellow. His body was lean and spindly, the arms slender as though they had never been put to any use. A queer man. The beard was sparse and the chest quite hairless, like a boy's. He did not like him. From the first moment Barabbas had seen him in the courtyard of the palace, he had felt there was something odd about him. What it was he could not say. It was just something he felt. He didn't remember ever having seen anyone like him before, though it must have been because he came straight from the dungeon and his eyes were still unused to the glare. That is why at first glance the man seemed to be surrounded by a dazzling light. Soon afterwards the light vanished, of course, and his sight grew normal again and took in other things besides the figure standing out there alone in the courtyard. But he still thought there was something very strange about him, and that he was not like anyone else. It seemed quite incredible that he was a prisoner and had been condemned to death, just as he himself had been. He could not grasp it. Not that it concerned him, but how could they pass a sentence like that? It was obvious he was innocent. Then the man who had been led out to be crucified, and he himself had been unshackled and told he was free. It was none of his doing. It was their business. They were quite at liberty to choose whomever they liked, and it just turned out that way. They had both been sentenced to death, but one of them was to be released. He was amazed himself at their choice. As they were freeing him from his chains, he had seen the other man between the soldiers disappear through the archway, with the cross already on his back. He had remained standing, looking out through the empty arch. Then the guard had given him a push and bellowed at him. "What are you standing there gaping for? Get out of here! You're free!" And he had awakened and gone out through the same archway. And when he saw the other dragging his cross down the street, he had followed behind him. Why, he did not know, nor why he had stood there hour after hour, watching the crucifixion and the long death agony, though it was nothing whatever to do with him. Those standing around the cross up there surely need not have been here. Not unless they wanted to. Nothing was forcing them to come along and defile themselves with uncleanness. But they were no doubt relations and close friends. Odd that they didn't seem to mind being made unclean. That woman must be his mother, though she was not like him. But who could be like him? She looked like a peasant woman, stern and morose, and she kept wiping the back of her hand across her mouth and nose, which was running because she was on the brink of tears. But she did not cry. She did not grieve in the same way as the others, nor did she look at him in the same way as they did. So it was evidently his mother. She probably felt far more sorry for him than they did, but even so she seemed to reproach him for hanging there, for having let himself be crucified. He must have done something to let himself in for it, however pure and innocent he was, and she just could not approve of it. She knew he was innocent because she was his mother. Whatever he had done, she would have thought so. He himself had no mother, and no father either, for that matter. He had never even heard one mentioned, and he had no relatives as far as he knew. So if he had been the one to be crucified, there would not have been many tears shed. Not like this. They were beating their breasts and carrying on as though they had never known the like of such grief, and there was an awful weeping and wailing the whole time. He knew the one at the right-hand cross quite well. If by any chance the fellow saw him standing down there, he probably thought it was because of him, in order to see him suffer well and truly. He wasn't. He was not here because of that at all. But he had nothing against seeing him crucified. If anyone deserved to die, it was that scoundrel. Though not because of what he had been sentenced for, but because of something quite different. But why was he looking at him and not at the one in the middle who was hanging there in his stead? It was because of him he had come. This man had forced him up here. He had a strange power over him. Power? If anyone looked powerless, he did. Surely no one could look more wretched hanging on a cross. The other two didn't look a bit like that, and didn't seem to be suffering as much as he was. They obviously had more strength left. He hadn't even the strength to hold his head up. It had flopped right down. Now he did raise it a bit, all the same. The lean, hairless chest heaved with panting, and his tongue licked his parched lips. He groaned something about being thirsty. The soldiers who were sprawled over a game of dice a little further down the slope, bored because the men hanging there took so long to die, did not hear. But one of the relatives went down and told them. A soldier got up reluctantly and dipped a sponge in a pitcher, passing it up to him on a stick. But when he tasted the fusty, tainted liquid offered him, he did not want it. The wretch just stood there grinning, and when he rejoined his companions, they all lay grinning at what had happened. The bastards! The relatives, or whoever they were, looked despairingly up at the crucified man, who was panting and panting. It was clear that he would soon give up the ghost. And just as well if the end came soon, Barabbas thought, so that the poor man would not have to suffer any more. If only the end would come. As soon as the end came, he would hurry away and never think of this again. But all at once the whole hill grew dark, as though the light had gone out of the sun. It was almost pitch dark, and in the darkness above, the crucified man cried out in a loud voice, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" It sounded horrible. Whatever did he mean? And why had it grown dark? It was the middle of the day. It was quite unaccountable. The 3 crosses were just faintly visible up there. It looked weird. Something terrible was surely going to happen. The soldiers had leapt to their feet and grabbed their weapons. Whatever happened, they always rushed for their weapons. They stood there around the crosses with their lances, and he heard them whispering together in alarm. Now they were frightened. Now they were not grinning any longer. They were superstitious, of course. He was afraid himself. and glad when it began to get light and everything became a little more normal. It got light slowly, as it does at dawn. The daylight spread across the hill and the olive trees around about, and the birds that had been silent started twittering again. It was just like dawn. The relatives up there were standing so still. There was no longer any sound of weeping and lamentation from them. They just stood, looking up at the man on the cross. Even the soldiers did so. Everything had grown so still. Now he could go whenever he liked, for it was all over now, and the sun shone again, and everything was just as usual. It had only been dark for a while, because the man had died. Yes, he would go now. Of course he would. He had nothing to stay for, not now that he, that other one, was dead. There was no longer any reason. They took him down from the cross. He saw before he went. The two men wrapped him in a clean linen cloth, he noticed. The body was quite white, and they handled it so carefully, as if they were afraid they might hurt it, however slightly, or cause it pain of any kind. They behaved so strangely. After all, he was crucified and everything. They were queer people, to be sure, but the mother stood with dry eyes, looking at what had been her son, and the rough, dark-complexioned face seemed unable to express her sorrow, only the fact that she could not grasp what had happened and would never be able to forgive it. He understood her better. As the sorry procession moved past some little distance from him, the men carrying the shrouded body and the women walking behind, one of the women whispered to the mother, pointing to Barabbas. She stopped short and gave him such a helpless and reproachful look that he knew he could not forget it. They went on down towards the Golgotha road and then turned off to the left. He followed far enough behind from them not to notice him. In a garden a short distance away they laid the dead man in a tomb that was hewn out of the rock. And when they had prayed by the tomb, they rolled a large stone in front of the entrance and went away. He walked up to the tomb and stood there for a while. He did not pray, for he was an evildoer, and his prayer would not have been accepted, especially as his crime was not expiated. Besides, he did not know the dead man. He stood there for a moment all the same. Then he, too, went in towards Jerusalem.